A first-class flight where every passenger should be treated equally. But when a flight attendant saw two black twin boys stepping into the cabin, suspicion immediately took over. Her eyes narrowed, her tone turned sharp, and then came the question laced with prejudice. Do these boys really belong in first class? What she didn't know, however, was that the woman accompanying them was no ordinary passenger. She was Eleanor Whitmore, the president of this airline. Shh, a shocking revelation, a storm breaking mid-air. What started as a single act of discrimination quickly escalated into a confrontation that would shake the entire system. Will those fueled by prejudice face the consequences? Will justice prevail? What do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed a similar injustice? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Eleanor Whitmore stood still, her eyes fixed on the overhead flight information board as she read the words, "Shh, Flight 107, New York to London, now boarding." She adjusted her dark-colored coat before turning to her twin sons, Elias and Ethan, who stood close by. The 12-year-old boys were brimming with excitement, their eyes sparkling as they took in the bustling airport scene. "This is our first time flying to Europe," Elias exclaimed, glancing at Ethan. "Just imagine, London, the museums, the castles, and maybe we'll even see one of those double-decker buses." Ethan smiled, clutching his sketchbook tightly. Unlike his brother, he wasn't as expressive, but inside, he was just as eager. He wanted to capture every moment of this trip, every street, every famous landmark, through his drawings. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on their shoulders, offering them a warm smile. "We're going to have an amazing journey. Now let's check in." The three of them made their way to the first-class check-in counter. Despite being the president of Whitmore Airlines, Eleanor always booked her tickets like any other passenger. She didn't want special attention or privileges. She preferred to experience her airline services just as an ordinary traveler would. The check-in agent greeted them politely, and within minutes, their tickets and luggage were processed. As soon as they received their boarding passes, Elias gleefully waved his in the air. "First-class seats! This is awesome!" he beamed. Eleanor chuckled softly, but her smile quickly faded as she noticed a stern-looking woman standing nearby, a middle-aged flight attendant with a rigid posture and scrutinizing eyes. Paula Wilkins. She stood a short distance away, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as she studied Elias and Ethan. The moment the family moved toward the boarding gate, Paula stepped forward, blocking their path. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice laced with forced politeness, but her expression betrayed clear suspicion. "Are you sure these are first-class tickets?" Eleanor remained composed. With an unwavering gaze, she calmly handed over their boarding passes, her tone steady and unshaken. "Yes, these belong to me and my sons." Paula took the tickets, her eyes narrowing further, as if searching for an error. Not because she needed to verify them, but because she didn't want to believe it. Two black boys dressed simply, backpacks slung over their shoulders, they didn't fit her idea of first-class passengers. Elias sensed her hesitation, his expression darkening. He took a small step back, but Ethan instinctively reached for his brother's hand, gripping it tightly. Both boys could feel the weight of her unwarranted doubt. After a few tense seconds, Paula begrudgingly returned the tickets. "Proceed to boarding," she said stiffly. Eleanor took the passes, nodding in acknowledgement, but inside, she couldn't ignore the unease creeping into her thoughts. She had encountered this kind of behavior before, and she knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Stepping into the first-class cabin, Elias and Ethan eagerly took in their surroundings. The spacious leather seats, personal entertainment screens, and serene atmosphere, everything was exactly as Eleanor had hoped for her sons. The boys quickly settled in, with Elias pulling out a science book from his bag while Ethan flipped open his sketch pad, already beginning to sketch the details around him. Eleanor leaned back into her seat, exhaling softly. She wanted her sons to enjoy this flight without a care in the world. But within minutes, she felt the unwelcome presence of Paula. The flight attendant stood nearby, her gaze locked onto the three of them. She didn't say a word, but Eleanor didn't need her to. She knew exactly what was going through Paula's mind. She was waiting for an excuse. Before long, Paula approached, her tone polite yet dripping with suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am." she said. Would you mind if I checked your tickets again? Eleanor slowly set down her magazine and turned to face Paula. I believe we already handled that at boarding, she replied coolly. Paula hesitated but pressed on. We have certain regulations regarding young passengers in first class. I just need to ensure. We have valid tickets, and I am traveling with my sons, Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm but firm. If you have any doubts, feel free to check with the airline system. Elias and Ethan exchanged tense glances. Ethan fidgeted with his sketch pad while Elias clenched his jaw, clearly frustrated but saying nothing. Paula lingered for a moment, her expression betraying her irritation. Finally, with a forced smile, she stepped back. Eleanor gently rested her hand on the armrest, but the sense of ease she had felt moments ago was gone. Her instincts told her this wasn't over. As the plane ascended into the sky, Elias and Ethan gradually regained their excitement. They animatedly chatted about the places they wanted to visit in London, laughing about all the fun things they would do. Eleanor listened, her warm smile returning. Then, Paula returned. This time, she didn't bother with an excuse about checking tickets. Instead, she stared directly at the boys, her voice sharp. This is a quiet cabin, she said. I expect the two of you to keep your voices down, or I will have to request an adjustment to your seating arrangement. Elias blinked, stunned. But we weren't doing anything wrong. Paula smirked slightly. This is a space for business professionals and high-end passengers. You two should learn how to behave accordingly. Ethan's grip tightened around his pencil. Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his leg before turning her attention to Paula. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes were piercing. Are you suggesting my sons don't belong in this cabin? She asked, her voice soft yet razor-sharp. Paula hesitated, but then shrugged nonchalantly. I'm simply stating the rules. If they disrupt other passengers, I have the right to step in. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She simply stared into Paula's eyes, unblinking, unshaken. And what she saw was arrogance, prejudice. She knew this type of person all too well, people who believed they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. Elias and Ethan looked at their mother, waiting for her response. Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, but her gaze turned cold as steel. Let's wait and see, she said slowly. She hadn't raised her voice, yet something about her tone made Paula hesitate. The flight was long. But Eleanor knew one thing for certain, and her patience had limits. Eleanor Whitmore let out a quiet sigh, her gaze drifting to the airplane window. The sky stretched endlessly before her, layers of clouds stacked like a masterpiece of nature. But instead of feeling the serenity that a first-class flight should bring, she sensed a storm brewing inside the cabin. Paula Wilkins still lurked nearby, casting glances at the twins that Eleanor couldn't ignore. Suspicion, contempt, irritation. It was all written plainly on the flight attendant's face. Elias and Ethan, though trying their best to ignore it, could feel that something was off. Elias turned to his mother, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Mom. His voice was quieter this time. Are we really welcome here? Eleanor slowly turned to look at her son. A small, reassuring smile appeared on her lips, but her eyes were cold and sharp. Of course we are, she replied firmly, leaning down to adjust Ethan's seatbelt. We paid for our seats. We belong here just as much as anyone else. Ethan nodded, but he still shrank back slightly, clearly sensing the tension in the air. And that tension didn't take long to explode. When dinner service began, a different flight attendant, a younger woman with a more professional demeanor, approached them with a polite smile, taking their meal orders without issue. Unlike Paula, she showed no disrespect. But just as she left, Paula reappeared. This time she held a tray of water in her hands. Boy, she said, her lips curling into an icy smile as she looked at Elias. I hope you know how to behave while eating. We don't want a mess in first class. Elias clenched his fists under the table. I'm not a child, he said firmly. Eleanor turned to Paula, her voice even but sharp. What did you just say? Paula shrugged, her fake smile never wavering. Just a friendly reminder. Young passengers aren't always familiar with the expectations of first class. Ethan lowered his head, but Elias couldn't hold back any longer. He lifted his chin, eyes blazing. We know how to behave, he said, his voice unwavering. But it seems like you don't know how to do your job. The entire cabin fell silent. Nearby passengers looked up, their curiosity piqued. Paula's eyes widened, clearly caught off guard by the defiance of a 12-year-old. Eleanor gave Elias a subtle squeeze on the shoulder, a silent message to stay calm. But deep down, she was proud. Her son wasn't afraid. He knew when to stand his ground. But Paula, she didn't take it well. Without warning, she tilted the tray, and in an instant, a glass of ice-cold water spilled straight onto Elias. The boy sucked in a sharp breath as the freezing liquid soaked into his shirt, sending a chill down his spine. Ethan gasped, jumping to his feet. "Mom!" The first-class cabin erupted into whispers and shocked murmurs. A few passengers looked outraged, while others simply gawked in disbelief. But Eleanor, she was the calmest person in the room. She slowly rose to her feet, her gaze sharp as a blade as she stared directly at Paula. "What did you just do?" Her voice was low, but dangerous. Paula tried to maintain her composure, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "It was just an accident. The boy should be more careful." "An accident?" Eleanor repeated, enunciating each word with chilling precision. Elias clenched his sleeves, anger burning in his eyes, but he said nothing. He simply looked to his mother, waiting for her response. And Eleanor did not disappoint. She slowly reached into her pocket, pulling out a sleek VIP membership card, holding it up in front of Paula's face. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore." Her voice rang out clearly, each word slicing through the tense atmosphere in the cabin. "I am the president of this airline." The cabin fell deathly silent. Paula froze, her entire body turning rigid, her expression shifting from shock to sheer panic. Ethan and Elias stared at their mother, their eyes wide. Around them, passengers started whispering, some already pulling out their phones, eager to capture the unfolding spectacle. The flight manager, a middle-aged man, rushed over the moment he heard the name Eleanor Whitmore. The second he recognized her, his face turned pale with realization. "Mrs. Whitmore, I sincerely apologize." Eleanor raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. Her gaze remained locked on Paula, who now looked ashen, her once smug confidence utterly shattered. "You have disrespected a passenger," Eleanor stated, her voice steady but laced with authority. "You deliberately humiliated and harmed my son. Did you really think you could walk away from this without consequences?" Paula opened her mouth, but no words came out. She stammered, her confidence crumbling. Eleanor turned to the flight manager. "I want her suspended immediately. When we land, she is to be placed under disciplinary review, effective today." Paula staggered back, her face ghostly pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, I didn't know who you were," she stuttered. Eleanor let out a cold, amused chuckle. "That's unfortunate for you." She then calmly knelt down, grabbing a napkin to gently dab the cold water off Elias's soaked shirt. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Elias took a deep breath, then nodded firmly. "Yes, Mom." Eleanor glanced up at Paula one last time. The woman was still standing there, shaking, speechless. With a serene expression, Eleanor simply returned to her seat, picking up her fork as if nothing had happened, because she knew the real storm was only just beginning. The air inside the first-class cabin grew thick, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Paula Wilkins, the flight attendant who once carried herself with arrogance and superiority, now stood frozen like a statue. She had likely never imagined that the woman she had looked down on throughout the flight was in fact the very person who held her fate in her hands. Eleanor Whitmore didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to show anger. One sentence from her had already turned Paula from the one in control to someone facing dire consequences. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. She gently placed her napkin on the table, her eyes still locked onto Paula as if dissecting every thought running through her mind. "What exactly did you just do to my son?" Eleanor asked again, her voice low and sharp like a blade. Paula's mouth fell open, clearly struggling to come up with an excuse. It was just an accident," she stammered. Elias remained motionless, his soaked shirt clinging to his skin. Though his lips were pressed tightly together, the humiliation burning in his eyes was unmistakable. "I don't believe that was an accident," Eleanor stated. emphasizing each word. Accidents don't happen when someone deliberately tilts a tray toward a passenger. Paula swallowed hard, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. But there was no way out. The silence in the first-class cabin was suffocating. Other passengers had stopped eating, completely fixated on the unfolding scene. Some had even pulled out their phones to record, while others whispered amongst themselves, shocked by what they had just witnessed. Paula's voice trembled as she tried again. "Mrs. Whitmore, I didn't know who you were. I was just doing my job." Eleanor let out a quiet chuckle, cold, mirthless, dripping with irony. "Your job?" She raised an eyebrow. "So your job is to harass passengers, unjustly accuse them, and pour water on a 12-year-old child?" Paula stood stiffly, unable to respond. Eleanor slowly picked up the glass of water in front of her, turning it in her hand, not because she was thirsty, but because she wanted Paula to feel every second of the pressure closing in on her. Then suddenly, another voice cut through the tension. "This is disgraceful." All heads turned toward the source. A middle-aged man dressed in an impeccably tailored suit leaned forward, his hands resting firmly on the table, his gaze filled with indignation as he glared at Paula. "I fly first class with this airline frequently," he said, "and I have never seen a flight attendant behave this way." His voice carried authority, disapproval, and sheer disappointment. "If this is how you treat passengers," he continued, his tone turning sharper, "then you shouldn't be working here at all." Immediately, several other passengers voiced their agreement. "She's been acting this way since they boarded the plane," a young woman in an elegant dress spoke up. "I noticed it earlier, but I didn't think she would be this outright rude." "That's right, I saw it too," another man added. Paula began trembling, her face draining of all color. She had completely lost control of the situation. Just then, the flight manager appeared, a man in his 50s with a stern expression. He moved swiftly toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, I sincerely apologize for what has happened," he said, bowing his head. "I assure you that we will handle this situation immediately." Eleanor set her glass down, her gaze never leaving Paula. "I want her suspended immediately," she said firmly. "I want this incident reported as soon as we land, and I want to see her off this flight the moment we arrive in London." Paula's breath hitched. She took a step back, panic flooding her features. "Mrs. Whitmore, I never meant to offend anyone. Please," she pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. Eleanor simply narrowed her eyes, her expression icy cold. "You don't need to beg me," she said. "You just need to take responsibility for your actions." The flight manager signaled to two other attendants, who quickly stepped forward to escort Paula out of the first-class cabin. As she was led away, soft applause rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded approvingly, clearly satisfied with the outcome. Elias and Ethan still looked stunned, but as the reality of the moment sank in, a flicker of pride appeared in Elias's eyes. Eleanor let out a quiet breath and turned to her son. "Are you all right?" Elias nodded slowly. "Yes, Mom." But then, his brows furrowed. "Will she get fired?" Eleanor smiled, a knowing gleam in her eyes. "She'll soon realize that her actions have consequences." Ethan gripped his sketchbook tightly, his voice full of emotion. "I hope this never happens again." Eleanor looked directly into her son's eyes. "Not to us," she said, "but there are others out there. And that's why I have to make sure that people like Paula never get the chance to harm anyone else." Elias gave a small smile, and Ethan followed. They didn't say it out loud, but in their hearts, admiration for their mother swelled, because today she had proven that justice wasn't just an idea, it was something worth standing up for. But Eleanor knew this story wasn't over. The airline needed a thorough investigation, and she would personally oversee it, because fairness shouldn't just be for a select few, it should be for everyone. Flight Tower 107 from New York to London continued its journey, but first class was no longer the same. After Paula Wilkins was escorted out by the flight manager, a calmer yet heavier atmosphere settled over the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the incident whispered among themselves, some still glancing at Eleanor Whitmore and her two sons with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Even with the situation handled, Eleanor could still feel the simmering anger in her chest. She wasn't the type to let emotions cloud her judgment, but the fact that Paula had so brazenly abused her authority, humiliating her sons in front of others, was something she could not forgive. And she wasn't going to let this end with just Paula's suspension. She wanted to dig deeper, because if Paula had the audacity to treat Elias and Ethan this way, then this was certainly not the first time she had mistreated a passenger, and Eleanor had decided she was going to expose the truth. The plane glided over the Atlantic Ocean, sunlight streaming through the window, casting reflections onto Eleanor's contemplative face. Elias still looked uncomfortable, rubbing his damp shirt against the seat, his face twisted in irritation. "It's hard to believe people like that exist," he muttered. Ethan, usually the quieter of the two, nodded in agreement. "How could she think she had the right to do that?" Eleanor gently patted their hands, her voice low but resolute. "People like Paula believe they get to decide who belongs and who doesn't," she said. "They have lived with that belief for so long that they see it as normal." Elias tilted his head, his brows furrowing. "So, what if you weren't the president of the airline? What if you were just a regular passenger?" Eleanor let out a small chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "We would have been removed from first class." The words were simple, yet heavy with truth. Elias froze. Ethan's eyes widened. It was a harsh reality, one they had never fully faced before. Before they could continue their conversation, the flight manager returned. The middle-aged man bowed his head slightly, his voice laced with deep respect. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have completed the internal report. Upon landing in London, our executive team will receive the full documentation." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you, but I need one more thing." The flight manager raised an eyebrow. "Of course, ma'am. What is it?" She locked eyes with him, her voice steady and deliberate. "I want every past complaint against Paula Wilkins compiled and sent directly to the CEO's office immediately." The flight manager visibly tensed for a second before quickly nodding. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor leaned back into her seat, sensing that the storm was about to spread, and she had no intention of stopping it. An hour and a half later, as the plane began its descent, an unexpected encounter took place. A young woman from first class approached Eleanor hesitantly, her expression a mix of uncertainty and determination. "Excuse me, Mrs. Whitmore," she began, her voice unsure. Eleanor looked up, her gaze softening slightly. "Yes? How can I help you?" The woman pressed her lips together before glancing toward the first-class cabin door. I I recorded what happened when Paula attacked your son." Elias's eyes widened in shock, and Ethan immediately sat up straighter. Eleanor studied the woman for a moment before speaking, her voice gentle but firm. "You recorded it?" The woman nodded, looking a bit uneasy. "I wasn't planning to get involved, but I couldn't just sit there and watch. If you need it, I can send you the video." A sharp glint flashed in Eleanor's eyes. "I would greatly appreciate that," she said. "Please send it to my personal email." The woman quickly pulled out her phone, tapping on the screen. Within seconds, she sent the file. A notification popped up on Eleanor's phone. She glanced at the screen. A slow, satisfied smile formed on her lips. She had evidence, and she wasn't going to be ignored. As soon as the plane's wheels touched the runway at London Heathrow, Eleanor immediately powered on her phone. She opened her email and played the video. Everything was clear as day. Paula deliberately tilted the tray of water. She made insulting remarks. She was visibly shaken upon learning Eleanor's identity. And the most damning part, she never apologized. Eleanor calmly pressed forward, entering the email addresses of the CEO and the head of human resources. She typed the subject line, "Evidence of flight attendant Paula Wilkins' misconduct. Request for a full investigation." Eleanor didn't write a lengthy email. She kept it to one single sentence. "This must never happen again." She hit send. Then she put her phone away, took her son's hands, and stepped off the plane. The real storm had just begun. The plane touched down at London Heathrow Airport, but the tension from the earlier incident still lingered in the first-class cabin. A heavy silence hung between the passengers. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something utterly unacceptable. Eleanor Whitmore said nothing, but inside her, a storm was raging. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity or her son's rights. She was ensuring that such discrimination would never happen again. As soon as the plane came to a full stop, the first class cabin doors opened and two airport security officers stepped in. Their eyes immediately locked onto Paula Wilkins, who stood frozen, her face pale with fear. One of the officers, a tall man in a crisp uniform, stepped forward and spoke in a firm, authoritative tone. Miss Paula Wilkins, you are immediately suspended due to serious misconduct during this flight. The airline will conduct an official investigation. You are required to disembark now. Paula's face drained of all color. Her lips trembled. I didn't, she stammered. Eleanor remained seated, but her gaze was icy cold. You have nothing to say, Paula, she said smoothly, her voice carrying absolute authority. And if I were you, I'd be very worried about what's coming next. Paula, now panicking, turned desperately toward the flight manager, her eyes pleading. You're not going to let this happen, are you? She almost begged. We can handle this quietly, can't we? The flight manager, now having lost all patience, responded coldly. You can explain yourself to the executive board later, but for now, you need to leave this plane. Paula was completely defeated. Seeing passengers still watching her, some with disgust, others curious, but none sympathetic. A long silence passed. Then her head dropped and she dragged her feet forward, her steps heavy with humiliation. The security officers escorted her off the plane, and as soon as she disappeared past the cabin doors, a round of applause erupted in first class. Eleanor looked up and saw many passengers clapping, some even glancing at her with genuine admiration. A well-dressed, middle-aged man smiled and spoke up. Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for standing up for all of us. Eleanor gave a gentle nod, but deep down she knew this wasn't over. The moment the plane landed, Eleanor wasted no time. She pulled out her phone and checked her email. The video evidence recorded by a fellow passenger was ready. Without hesitation, she forwarded the footage to the CEO, head of human resources, and the chairman of the board, attaching only one sentence. This behavior cannot continue. I want an immediate investigation. She hit send. Then she put her phone away, her gaze fixed forward, because she knew the real battle was just beginning. 48 hours later, at Whitmore Airlines headquarters, an emergency meeting was convened. All senior executives, department heads, and legal advisors were present. No one took this matter lightly. On the large screen in the boardroom, the video of Paula Wilkins' actions played back. There was no denying what had happened. Paula deliberately tilted the tray, spilling water onto Elias. She made derogatory remarks, her prejudice blatantly clear. Even when confronted, she refused to apologize. As the video ended, a dead silence filled the room. Finally, CEO Samuel Green exhaled deeply, turning toward Eleanor. We've reviewed Paula Wilkins' entire complaint history, he said gravely. And you were right. This was not the first time. The screen changed, displaying a long record of complaints from past passengers, verbally harassing customers over personal biases, displaying discriminatory behavior towards certain passengers, negligence in her duties, but always finding ways to avoid disciplinary action. Eleanor's lips curled slightly, not in satisfaction but in confirmation. She had suspected this all along, and now she had the evidence to change the system. I want this investigation expanded, Eleanor said firmly. Not just Paula. I want a full review of our hiring and training policies. I want to know how many other flight attendants like her are out there. Some executives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly surprised by the scale of her demand. But Samuel Green didn't object. He nodded slowly, thoughtful and serious. You're asking for a complete overhaul? He asked. Eleanor didn't blink. Exactly, she replied. I want every employee who thinks they have the right to mistreat passengers to be removed. A long silence settled over the boardroom. Then Samuel Green rose to his feet. I agree. In the weeks that followed, Whitmore Airlines became the center of media attention. A series of sweeping changes were announced. Paula Wilkins was officially terminated and faced the possibility of legal action. A major overhaul of employee training was launched. All flight attendants were required to undergo courses on professional ethics and anti-discrimination policies. The press covered the story extensively, and Eleanor became a symbol of change. But to her, this was never about personal victory. It was a reminder that justice is not a luxury, it is a necessity, and no one has the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. The storm Eleanor Whitmore started had changed an entire system.